Hello, this is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And we're really delighted today to be joined by John Walcott, a highly respected reporter, editor, and for 4 decades, and now he's a professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. John has had a remarkable career. He was born in Paterson, New Jersey, as he told me, 59 miles and 3 weeks away from Bruce Springsteen. So we might ask for some Springsteen sightings during his career. But John grew up in Bergen County, New Jersey, which is a suburb of New York, went to Williams College in Massachusetts, had a really remarkable career in journalism, working for such important institutions as the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Time, Reuters, Bloomberg, U.S. News and World Report, Knight-Ridder and McClatchy. He's been, among other things, a foreign correspondent, reporting from or about 80 different countries in the course of his career. He was the bureau chief of Knight-Ridder in 2002, 2003, when the United States decided to go to war in Iraq. And Knight-Ridder was one of the major institutions, and maybe one of the only institutions in the press, that challenged the Bush administration's claims about the linkage between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, and also the allegations about weapons of mass destruction. Did some really important reporting, so much so that the work of Knight-Ridder was memorialized in a movie in 2018 called Shock and Awe, in which John was played by Rob Reiner. We'll talk a little bit about that movie, but more importantly about that whole period in his career. John's won a number of awards, including the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence, which was awarded by the Nieman Foundation at Harvard. He's a co-author of a book with David Martin of CBS called Best Laid Plans, The Inside Story of America's War on Terrorism, published in the late 80s. So John was ahead of the curve on the terrorist threat that faced the United States. And he's taught media and international relations at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service for about a quarter century. And John joins us from his home in Cape Cod on a beautiful sunny day. So John, how are you doing?
It's a beautiful sunny day. What can I say? And thank you for the very kind introduction, which underscores the point that I can't hold a job.
Well, let's talk about your career in journalism. When you were studying in college at Williams, was this something that was clear to you that was your calling? Was this something your parents maybe had an influence in? How did you get launched in your career in journalism?
Well, the short answer to that is I couldn't find a job anywhere else. I graduated in 1971, and that was the era of wage and price controls, if you remember that. You can explain to the younger members of the audience what those were. And I had worked 2 summers in an advertising agency in New York, Ogilvy and Mather, one of the predominant ad agencies, and I enjoyed it, but it was definitely not my calling. So I took a job at a very small 18,000 circulation local newspaper in the suburbs of New York City. They paid me $110 a week, for which my take-home pay, which I still remember, was $88.91. And I probably learned more in my 5 or 6 months there than I learned in 4 years in college about, how to cover a story, how to uncover the truth, etc. And, I really realized that was my calling by doing it. And I don't know any other way. I had college classmates who knew they wanted to be doctors. That's a real calling that you need to hear early on. Journalism less so. So I stumbled into it is the short answer, and found out I loved it.
John, we had a New York Times correspondent, Carl Hulse, here about 5-6 weeks ago, and Carl is from Illinois. And so he, in the course of his comments to our audience, he mentioned that he began his career working for small newspapers in Illinois, and he made the point. He says working as a a reporter for a small town newspaper is one of the most difficult jobs in journalism, because you face your audience every day, you face the subjects every day. The facts that you report, are essential to how people are regarded in the community. I mean, talk about just the skills that you picked up I know you covered school boards and planning commissions, that sort of thing. Talk about just the importance of working in in the kind of small town journalism as a way of getting your foundational skills.
Well, number one, I couldn't agree more with what Carl said, that the idea of having to write about people you're likely to bump into in the street is essential. And it's just as essential in Beirut or Beijing as it is anywhere else. One of the things that troubles me, we can talk about this later, is that a lot of journalism now, as local papers have literally died off, is that a lot of reporting is farther and farther removed from the audience. And it seems very distant without those local newspapers. But in terms of the skills you acquire quite quickly on the job, I'll give you a couple of examples. Number one, if you want to know what is really going on crime-wise in a town, you don't ask the police chief or the mayor. You ask the cop on the beat or the people who live there. And today's journalism is cluttered with people who think the higher rank a source has, the better they are, when in my experience, the inverse is more often true. And, if you want to know what's going on in a war, you don't ask the general. He'll give you spin. The second thing you learn very quickly is if you're covering, say, a fatal automobile accident, and there are 6 eyewitnesses, and you interview all of them, you'll get 7 versions of what happened. And you have to sort through that. Which ones corroborate other ones, which ones are the outliers. Those are the sorts of skills, sort of innate skepticism that you learn at a local newspaper. I think Carl's exactly right. And I think we read a lot about the cost of local news dying off. What we haven't read as much about as I think we should is the fact that it deprives young people who want to be reporters from the opportunity to learn that from the ground up.
Right. Well, I mean, we could spend the whole hour talking about just your journalism experiences. I mean, they've been so varied and so consequential. But the one that I'm struck at how you sort of fell into the role of a foreign correspondent. I think maybe your first, kind of full immersion. One of your early jobs was at Newsweek, and you became the chief diplomatic correspondent. And when we think about foreign correspondents, of course, they seem to be a dying breed, but there's a certain amount of glamour attached to the job. But as I've seen you say in interviews, I mean, it's hard travel. Oftentimes you're thrust into war zones. You see things that nothing can prepare you to see. You're away from your family for long stretches of time. Talk about how you became a foreign correspondent, and both the allure and the difficulty of that position.
Again, I sort of stumbled into it. I was the Newsweek rewrite man for the Camp David summit that President Carter hosted up at Camp David. And somehow that convinced the bureau chief at the time, the late Mel Elfin, great journalist from whom I learned a great deal, decided, well, I could take that job. The guy who had it decided to walk away from it. So there was a vacancy, and I was literally tossed into it. And again, very much like that experience in Bergen County, once I was tossed into the water, I found I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the travel. Everything you said about the cost of it, is real. And if anything, it cost maybe higher today than it was then. But the best comparison I could draw is it's like being a permanent graduate student. You are always learning new things. You're always being challenged to make sense of something you never understood. but it also gives you the opportunity to meet people that very few people ever get a chance to meet. You know, I'm frequently asked, for example, you know, who was the most memorable person you ever interviewed? It's an easy question for me. It's Nelson Mandela. Never met anyone like that. You know, I've met a lot of good people, but there was some quality this man had. 27 years in captivity. He emerged to reunite or unite a nation that had sent him to jail for 27 years. So there's really no substitute for having a front row seat for those kinds of things. And I was fortunate that in a time, you know, very much like the one we're living through now, the world was changing pretty rapidly. China was rising, the old Soviet Union was collapsing. You know, the Middle East was, as it always has been, at war with itself. So there's a lot going on. And, you know, it's hard to walk away from that. And so I never did.
Well, let's talk about just the difference between being a reporter and an editor. I mean, what were the kind of competing satisfactions for you in terms of the two distinct jobs within the journalism industry?
I'm not sure they're totally distinct. You know, there's an old aphorism that you cannot lead people to someplace you've never been yourself. And so, you know, when it came time during the first Gulf War, 1990, 1991, to have to assign people to go to Saudi Arabia to be prepared to cover the invasion of Iraq, I was much better equipped to do that because I'd been in war zones myself. And so I knew what I was asking people to do, and they knew I knew. And, you know, there was some advice you can give people along those lines. And second, I never stopped being a reporter. You mentioned, and I thank you for mentioning shock and awe, but there are a couple of scenes in there that show me reporting. And it was kind of a standing joke in the office that I used to go to a Lowe's hardware store about 25 miles outside Washington to meet people, you know, who didn't want to be seen meeting me anywhere closer to the Capitol than that. And so that kind of reporting gave me the confidence to keep the reporters headed in a direction that no one else was headed. And so if I hadn't done my own reporting to back that up, I think I would have had less confidence in doing reporting that was completely at odds with what the most prestigious news outlets, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the networks, were doing. So I don't think editors should ever stop being reporters. And I don't think you can be a good editor without having been at least a decent reporter. And, you know, the editors I know, you know, Marty Barron, when he was at the Boston Globe, really taking on criticism of the Roman Catholic Church, which in Boston is not an easy thing to do. You know, he had come up pretty much the same way. And so, you know, I think the only big difference is looking at stories and asking how they could be better. And maybe the best advice I ever gave a reporter was to a reporter who needed less advice from me than anyone else, a guy named Joe Galloway, who I think was the greatest war correspondent of the Vietnam War era. He's passed away now. But Joe came to me, wanted to do a story on the 25th anniversary of the first battle between the United States Army and the People's Army of Vietnam in the Ad Drang Valley in what was then South Vietnam. And he came back, gave me a draft of the story, and I gave it back to him. And I told him one thing that I had learned along the way: don't describe the death of a single American soldier until you've told me who he was. Where did he come from? Did he have a wife and kids? Who was he? You know, don't just kill him off as a name, make him human. So people feel at least a modicum of the emotion that people who loved him felt. And that comes from experience. That's not some genius, and it's not something you learn, forgive me, in school. You learn it along the way, I think.
Right. Well, let's talk about Iraq. And this spring has been the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And many people think it was one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of the last half century. Some say it was one of the worst foreign policy mistakes the United States has made in its history. And let's kind of remember the context, because right after 9/11, the nation was totally shaken. You're the bureau chief of Knight-Ridder, and literally the day after 9/11, you send your reporters out to figure out, where we go from here. And some of them come back and say, man, the Bush administration is starting to talk about Iraq. And at one point you write, getting the American public to support a war against a country that had not attacked the United States required the administration to tell a convincing story why the war was necessary. For that, it needed the press. So let's talk about, as you do in a powerful article called Why the Press Failed in Iraq, the public policy, the political figures, need to answer for themselves. But you also believe that the press needs to explain what it did and why it was not more skeptical about the administration's claims in Iraq. So talk about, and you hinted at this, just what the kind of mainstream press reaction to the early signals that the Bush administration wanted to go to war in Iraq, and how you at Knight-Ridder approached the issue.
Well, I think the other news organizations missed an immediate red flag, which was the attempt by the administration to link Iraq and Al-Qaeda, which made absolutely no sense. And that's really what triggered our persistent skepticism at Knight-Ridder. Saddam Hussein was a secular Arab ruler who feigned allegiance to Islam, whose two sons were a couple of booze-swilling skirt chasers, hardly the model. And that's not where Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and other Salafi Muslims were. If anything, they wanted to knock off people like Saddam and replace them with their idea of an Islamic caliphate. So that's one. That signal was missed. And I think the second problem, as you mentioned, I alluded to earlier, and that was granting far too much respect to people on account of their rank. And we followed that principle that I talked about earlier, dug down to into the ranks of the military community, the intelligence community, and discovered there were very few people who knew what they were talking about, who were making the arguments that the administration was making, that there was convincing proof that Saddam had a secret nuclear weapons program. And again, some of the things the administration tried to sell, or its allies in what was then the Iraqi National Congress tried to sell. One of them was Saddam Hussein had, secret chemical weapons facilities in the basement of his palaces. Now, wait a minute. If you had a secret chemical weapons lab, would you put it in your basement? I doubt it. The other one was that there was a Kurd who had the full run of all of the secret facility. No Iraqi is going to give a Kurd the full run. So there were signals all over the place that something just didn't check out. And those are the signals we followed, rather than simply parroting what Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and others said, with all due respect for their rank and, what they did to climb the ladder to get there. And it goes back to what I said about the police chief. I don't want to talk to the police chief. I'll talk to him. It's my duty. I'll listen to him. But I also want to talk to the cop on the beat. And so that's what we did. And then the third thing that I think is alluded to in the movie, in fact, it's not only alluded to, there's a speech I gave in the newsroom that Rob Reiner repeats in the movie. Our audience was not in New York or Washington or even Los Angeles or Chicago. It was in places like what is now Fort Moore, then Fort Benning in Albany, Georgia. We happen to own the paper in Albany, Georgia. We had something like 50 newspapers we had newspapers that were adjacent to about 50 military bases, ranging from Anchorage, Alaska, down to Florida. And as I said in the newsroom then, we don't write for people who send other people's kids to war. We write for people whose kids get sent to war. And that was the other, I think, big difference, was that was our audience. And, it's a little bit like what I said before about the loss of local newspapers. They write for those audiences, not for each other or for the people in power in Washington. I think that may have been, in retrospect, maybe the biggest factor.
Well, John, you also make the point, and it's an important one, that a lot of the press, and we'll just talk about the New York Times, and they had a kind of a star reporter, and the administration would leak things to her, and she would write, administration claims, Saddam is poised to attack, so-and-so. And, they would leak that view to her. She would run it prominently in the paper, and that became the dominant narrative. And very few reporters actually checked out the substance of the administration's claim. They just kind of blindly reported the claim. And that, I know you've pointed out, is really a pernicious flaw that a lot of journalists get caught up in.
No, I think that's right. And I think, if anything, the problem has gotten worse as speed has become more and more important, the race to have a scoop. And an awful lot of the scoops I've read, really were better used in ice cream parlors than in newspapers, because it takes time to do the fact checking, and we don't have time. We got to be first. And then there's the problem of reporters who really want to be part of the establishment. That they really want to go to the parties and have their names in Politico as having attended this or that party. And I think that flies in the face of what, to me at least, good journalism is. There's a wonderful cartoon after I.F. Stone, one of the I think great investigative reporters. After he died, there was a cartoon of him standing at the gates of heaven, and whoever is guarding the gate, St. Peter, is on the phone to God saying, "No, sir, he'd rather stay out here and keep things honest." And that about sums it up as far as I'm concerned.
Well, John, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit by reading a citation of an award that you received from your university, Williams. You received a bicentennial medal citation. And I want to read a couple sentences of it, because the context is they're talking about how much of the mainstream media just, casually accepted the claims of the administration, and Knight-Ridder, under your leadership, was more skeptical. And it says, it's referring to you, it says, your every instinct told you those stories were not true. Your sources then agreed, and so did the many documents that you unearthed. You published exposés over and over. You took a lot of heat for them, were called names, told you are unpatriotic, and we did launch that war, one that will have devastating impacts on individuals, families, and nations for more than a generation. History has proved you are right. You even had the bittersweet experience of seeing yourself in the person of Rob Reiner, glorified in the movie Shock and Awe, showing for a wide audience that sometimes old school is best, and raising the right questions and standing up for truth at whatever cost represent an especially valuable form of patriotism. Not a bad citation to have attached to your name.
No, I'm very proud that my alma mater thought enough of me to give me that award, and thanks to whoever wrote that rather lavish citation.
John, let's talk about the challenges confronting journalism today. And in an essay, a recent essay, you talked about what you called today's bleak media environment. And you've made several allusions, but what is it? How do you see the face of the media world right now? What are your most serious concerns? What are areas of encouragement?
Well, I think the most serious area of concern is the collapse of the economic foundation of the industry that has affected almost all news organizations, save the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. The Los Angeles Times today just laid off 74 newsroom employees. A few of them, I think, reporters, not all of them, but copy editors, editors, and that's, one of the most important newspapers in the country. So smaller newspapers are dying off, almost on a daily basis. And I find that discouraging for some of the reasons I discussed earlier. What's more encouraging, and what I hope, students at Southern Illinois and elsewhere are paying attention to, is the attempt by local news organizations to counter that trend by either with nonprofits or with support from, donors. And that's happening all over the country, to try to connect more of America to what's going on in the world, and to try to help more of America understand what people in power, whether it's political power, economic power, social power, are doing and what it means to them. And I think we've lost touch of that with that. And I think that's one reason that the country is in the state it is in today, is people don't feel that the government is working for them, don't feel that the people in power, whether it's on Wall Street or in Silicon Valley or in Washington, give a damn about them. I just saw a story, fascinating story on, I think, NBC Nightly News last night, about a new technology they're using in farm fields in California that uses artificial intelligence and lasers to weed farm fields. And there was an allusion to it, but if I were assigning reporters to that story, one of the questions I'd be asking is, how many jobs is this going to cost? And what's going to happen to those people who scratched out literally a living doing that work? And second, how many people can afford this technology? How many farmers can afford $1 million worth of artificial intelligence, maintain it, know how to use it, etc.? And, I hope these local news organizations that are springing up are the ones that are going to ask those questions, rather than simply saying, "Whoa, here's a great new technology," without asking what the cost is. One of the things I've talked about at Georgetown for a number of years in class is that lack of skepticism about the claims that social media would unite the world. It would give everyone a voice. And there was far too little skepticism about the possible downsides of giving everyone a voice, which are now, I think, all too evident. So I have a lot of hope for these local news organizations. I hope they survive. I hope they prosper. I hope they hire young people and give them the kind of experience I had in Bergen County.
Well, you've made the point that time and resources are an important part of good journalism. And you had made a fascinating reference to a project, I think, when you were bureau chief at Knight-Ridder, in which you wanted to look at the Bush administration's detainee program. And you dispatched reporters and photographers to go to 11 countries on 3 months on 3 continents over 8 months to dig into this story and pull it together. I mean, that is an enormous commitment of resources for a major investigation. There are not many organizations that have the resources or the patience to do that at this point, are there?
No, there are very few. And again, that takes time. And there are a few news organizations. The New York Times still does work like that. The Washington Post still does some work like that. The networks are still doing work like that. But, when I started on the State Department beat in 1981, I learned an awful lot from Hank Truitt, who was the chief foreign correspondent for the Baltimore Sun, and from Bill Beecher, who filled that role at the Boston Globe. Those papers just don't do that kind of work anymore. Even in your area, the Chicago Tribune, St. Louis Post-Dispatch do very little of that kind of work. And now the Los Angeles Times is largely out of that business. And that's all the cost of as I say, the collapse of the economic foundation of the industry. Print advertising just doesn't make the money it used to make. And online advertising doesn't either. So, looking back, that was, kind of the high point of the industry, I guess. We had more luxury of time and money.
Yeah, and let's talk about maybe a little bit more narrowly, but not too much, political journalism and where we're at with that. And there's a famous comment by Nicholas Lehman attributed to him, in which he's once said, "It often seems to me that at any given moment, 99% of the journalists are covering 1% of what's happening in the world." And I was just thinking of that when I was seeing some of the footage from the debt ceiling drama, we'll call it, in which, and I did that for many, many years, but, out in the corridors of the Capitol, literally dozens and dozens of reporters are surrounding Speaker McCarthy as he's talking about, his strategy or whatever it is. And so I wonder just, I'd like you maybe to respond to something I just read earlier by a gentleman I'm sure you had many dealings with in the past, Jim Fallows. And Fallows, in a recent essay, and I think this is a theme that he's pushed for a while, he thinks that there's too much political reporting and forecasting. And he said, we need less political reporting and future casting and more of everything else. I've long argued that Americans would be better informed and simply more interested in the news, and reporters would feel more energized, engaged, and useful if 90% of today's political press were redeployed on other beats, and if 90% of the airtime and online emphasis were given to other topics. When you read the presidential politics stories or sit through the electoral forecast panels, the world is unsurprising and gray. When you read or learn about anything else, it's full color and 3D. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't agree with Jim on a number of things. I mean, he, among other things, wrote that Japan was going to take over the world, and he was off by, a few hundred miles. But I do agree with him to some extent. I think it'd be better if, pick your number, 80% of those journalists on Capitol Hill were redeployed to Carbondale, Illinois, and Billings, Montana, and Phoenix, Arizona, and places like that. Not to talk. Talking has become, far too important. What matters in journalism is listening. I don't know about you, but I've generally found that I learn more from listening than I do from talking. So there's, too much talk and not enough action in journalism today. And it's concentrated, I agree with Jim completely. It's concentrated in Washington, and this ridiculous race to predict who's going to win the Republican nomination with very few facts to go on, starting with the question of whether the former president will be indicted, and if so, on what charges. We don't know that, but we're going to guess anyway. And the debt ceiling was exactly the same way. People covered the drama, what was going on backstage, focused on a question they couldn't answer, which is what's going to happen. And it's this breathless rush to fill every minute of every day with, some modicum of news that I think has turned people off, and it helps explain why the credibility of the press is somewhere down along with Congress, because too many reporters are writing too little about what matters to too many people. So as I said, I wouldn't redeploy people necessarily to other beats. I'd redeploy them to other places, and where they listen. I mean, one great example of that from a different part of the world was my father-in-law, who was a top executive at one of the major oil companies. Maybe the best idea he ever had was to have their stations charge the same price for gas, whether it was paid with a credit card or paid with cash. It wasn't his idea. He got that idea from spending 3 days a week listening to guys who ran gas stations. They didn't go to Harvard Business School. They didn't go to Stanford Business School. They didn't go to Wharton. They went to high school, but they ran gas stations and they were the front lines. They were the guys who listened to the consumers. That's where that idea came from listening. And there's too little listening and too much talking going on, I think.
Well, let's talk about the 2024 presidential campaign. I'm not going to ask you to do any predictive work, but there is, of course, the question about how to cover President Trump. And it seems that there's a couple schools of thought. I mean, the first is cover him like he's a regular candidate. He's a front runner, cover him as a candidate. Another one says ignore him. He led an insurrection against the American government. He's under state indictment, maybe federal indictment. Just stay away from him. A third school, which seems to be kind of the unstated practice of much of the press corps, is to broadcast the Trump show and just embrace it. He's the best show in town. When you write about him or talk about him, ratings soar, clicks increase, etc. Given that broad realm of approaches, I mean, if you were the bureau chief at Knight-Ridder now, and you're sitting down with your team of reporters and planning to cover the 2024 presidential campaign, what guidance would you give them?
Well, I'd throw out the third option, and I'd throw it out about Joe Biden the same way I throw it out against Donald Trump. And to be honest with you, I think we've seen as much of that on the left as we have on the right. The unending focus on and criticism of Trump. But I don't think you can cover him the way you'd cover any other candidate, for one simple reason that's hard to deal with. He lies. That's flat out it. He may believe what he's saying, but it isn't true. The 2020 election was not stolen. I'm sorry. The investigations into him are not witch hunts for partisan purposes. But he is trading on an old aphorism in journalism, which was that the lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. And he's outrun the truth. And now in today's internet world, the lie is around the world 6 or 8 times before the truth can get out of the gate. And, he's prospered for that. So I think you have to be very careful in simply reporting everything any candidate says, because they're all guilty of this to one degree or another. It's called spin. But he has gone beyond spin into outright falsehoods. And so repeating those falsehoods, whether you like it or not, gives some credence to them, plays to his audience. So I think you have to be very, very careful in terms of what you report about him. And, when he says something, the eternal question, since I teach at Georgetown, I can say it in Latin, is cui bono, who benefits from this? Why is he saying this? What's the motive? Who's he appealing to? And I think you have to ask those questions, but you also have to ask him of President Biden and every other candidate. And I hope that what you and others are doing with students is helping to pave the path you describe in this new world where speed matters above all else and attention matters above all else. toward responsible journalism. And it's harder to be responsible today, given those pressures to be first and to attract a big audience. So MSNBC attracts a big audience by being loyal to a certain set of beliefs. And on the other end, so does Fox News, and somewhere beyond the other end is Tucker Carlson, who is simply a participant, in no way independent.
John, I saw an essay that George Packer wrote in The Atlantic. This was actually last fall, and I want to read a couple sentences because I'd like you to react to it. He said, "Journalists can't stop covering Trump, but we do him a big favor and the public none by magnifying his presence, analyzing the tone of his every utterance, depending on his ever obscenity for sales and distraction. If Trump runs again, journalists would do better to follow the money that supports him, report on the party that has come to embody him, talk with the people who vote for them, explore the conditions of their lives, dig into the issues that move them, trace the lies that beguile them, and when Trump says nothing new, ignore him." Does that seems to touch on what you're saying?
Yeah, I think George said it better than I did. But I think that's exactly right. Every time you repeat what he says, you're amplifying it. And so why would you hand a megaphone to a guy who's already got a loudspeaker? But I think we also have to ask another question that goes back to some things I've said before. How in God's name did this guy ever get elected president? There's a temptation to think that Donald Trump is responsible for all the ills in our political system. I would argue that he's a product of ills in our political system that have been building up for 50 years as people have lost jobs to technology or to China or whatever. I wrote a piece not too long ago about, my fellow New Jersey and Mr. Springsteen. If the president gave him an award, which richly deserved, but I wrote that the Democrats and the Republicans would have been far better off listening to what Springsteen was singing 40, 50 years ago. And there's lines like, because he grew up, in middle-class Freehold, New Jersey, writing lines like, they're closing down the textile mill across the railroad tracks. Foreman said these jobs are going, boys, and they ain't coming back. Well, what did politics do about that? Did it prepare new vocational education programs? Are we training people to do solar panels? Are we training people to maintain electric automobiles? What are we doing for those people who aren't going to go to Harvard or Williams or Southern Illinois? No wonder they're angry. No wonder they feel disaffected. Trump capitalized on all of that. He didn't cause it. And so he poses as a friend of those people. He talks the way they do. I think some of his grammatical errors resonate with those folks, make them think he's one of them when nothing could be farther from the truth. So I think we have to look back and ask how we came to this impasse and what we can learn from that moving forward. And that goes back to the point I keep making. We've got to go to where people live and listen to them. What are they looking for? What frightens them? What angers them? And what are we doing about it? Whether we're in power in politics, whether we're Elon Musk or any of the other tech moguls who make more in a year than the GDP of any number of countries, and at the moment are laying off workers and still collecting enormous salaries, almost incomprehensible salaries. No wonder people are angry. So Trump capitalized on that. But we got to go back and take a harder look at how we got to that, to where we are now.
John, we've had a couple questions emailed in, and one of them pertains to a subject we touched on just a little bit, artificial intelligence. The question is, how do you think the recent emergence of artificial intelligence as a composition tool will affect the media's ability to ascertain what is truthful and what is accepted by readers as truthful? And maybe even to broaden it out, I mean, you had mentioned references to how artificial intelligence may affect just the structure of the news business. I read someplace that I guess AP for 5 or 6 years has been using artificial intelligence to publish earnings report from companies. So I guess two things. I mean, how is artificial intelligence affecting the journalism world? And I know we could spend a full hour on that topic alone. So take at least a bite at that apple.
Well, I'll try to fall short of an hour. We did an interesting experiment in class at Georgetown last semester. I asked the students, the graduate students and the master's program, in the middle of the class to take 10 minutes and write a story about the state of the Ukraine-Russia war. And one of the students popped up and said, let's ask ChatGPT to do the same assignment. And the story that Chat came up with was junk. It was just terrible. And it reflects what my father, who was an electrical engineer, always said about computers: garbage in, garbage out. And, you know, Chat merely harvests what's already out there and doesn't really make that distinction. You know, it can be useful for a lot of things. I mentioned it in the farm fields. I think in medicine, it has enormous potential. But I think when it comes to the matter of discovering what's true and what's not, it really complicates matters because, you know, you can't believe what you see anymore. And that's only going to get worse. This is a technology in its infancy. So what you see and hear may be partly real, wholly made up, and it's very hard to tell the difference. If I have any hope, and this is true of my friends in the intelligence business as well, I think it may put a greater emphasis on actually meeting people face to face and relying less on meetings like this. I got to assure your audience, this is real. There's no visual reality. If I need to, I'll bring the dog in and you can see him and he'll talk to you. But I think one of the answers to that is, once again, get the hell out of the office, get away from the computer and talk to people face to face, whether they're people in power or folks on the street. That may be the only way left to distinguish what's real from what's, as I say, partially real or wholly made up. As this technology advances, which it inevitably will. I love all these appeals to let's stop it in its tracks. Good luck with that. There's no money in stopping it in its tracks, so it isn't going to stop in its tracks. So I think as journalism, we got to think very hard about how we deal with that, and how can we overcome the dangers it presents, and I think it does present real dangers. As it advances, it can sound like somebody, it can look like somebody, but it isn't. Scary.
Another question is, how do you assess the struggles that CNN is now undergoing and refers to, they're kind of unveiling this streaming service, which they then canceled, the firings, including the recent one of the CEO, the Trump town hall. I mean, how do you look at CNN and understand it in the context of the current media environment?
Well, first of all, I have a lot of good friends at CNN who do great work. But again, the economic foundations are shaky. Cable news in general, everything on cable now. There are 4,000 streaming services. It's hard to build a loyal audience without being politically aligned the way Fox News is. I mean, it has a huge audience because it tells people what they want to hear. And that is a winning formula. If you want to maintain an audience, you just tell people what they want to hear and you leave out the stuff they don't want to hear. And I think Chris Licht at CNN was trying to find a middle ground between doing journalism the right way and playing to a loyal audience at a time when the country is more polarized than it's been, at least since the era of the end of the Depression and the period prior to the entry into World War II, when there was an strong isolationist movement, or maybe since, the era of the Civil War, when the differences were led to a terrible war. And I think he was trying to find a middle ground. I don't think he, did it in a particularly graceful way, but I have to respect what I think he was trying to do in a very difficult time. One in which the temptation to build that loyal audience by telling them what they want to hear, whether they hate Trump, love Trump, whatever, is enormous. The big question is what will happen at CNN now. I think they have 3 people overseeing the organization. That's usually not a formula for success, but how does it evolve? But the people I know at CNN, want to do the right thing. They want to be journalists. They want to stay apart from the corridors of power. They want to be observers. And I wish them well, but it's tough. It's tough for all the networks.
John, tell us about your class at Georgetown. I know it's called Media and World Affairs. I think you start from Julius Caesar, maybe bring in some Gutenberg, just kind of talk about this information revolution and I guess how it's affected public policy. Tell us a little bit about it and what you like about the issues you deal with and how your students are reacting to them.
Well, first of all, we don't start with Julius Caesar. Hell no, we start with Plato.
Okay.
And well, no, Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, is one in which Socrates questions the value of writing, making the argument that when you can write things down, you won't remember them. Hello, Google. 2,000 years ago, that was the argument. Today, that's the argument. And you see it in the classroom, I'm sure I do. So it goes from that. Then, Caesar's Gallic Wars are a lesson in self-promotion. So we talk about, who was his audience? What was he trying to achieve? What was he broadcasting? The key question there is, which values of the Roman establishment was he playing up in his own writings? And then secondly, the simple point that there's no way to fact check that because Vercingetorix and the other Gauls didn't write their own accounts of Rome's conquest of them. So he's the only standing account of what's there, and that presents some journalistic problems. Gutenberg, technology. First great technological revolution. And what effect did that have? We talked some about the Protestant Reformation and Luther's ability. If you ever have a chance, there's a great book called Brand Luther about how Luther employed the printing press and the way he wrote to appeal to a broader audience, in German, but in colloquial German, not academic German. And then we gone through radio and telegraph and so on and so forth, on into the internet, and what I alluded to before, some of the works that were written, Eugene Morozov and others, who questioned where social media and the internet were taking us, and then trying to apply that lesson some to AI. We did a lot more on AI last semester than I'd ever done before, in exploring the pros and cons of it, the question you asked earlier. I end every semester, and you probably do too, I think most of us do, thinking that I learned far more from my students than they learned from me. And I think it's especially true for two reasons at Georgetown. Number one, a number of my students are not American. This year I had 2 Chinese, 1 South Korean, 1 from Uganda, from whom I learned that Uganda has 56 languages, of whom he spoke 6. And the rest were Americans. And then there's a generational difference. They're digital natives now. That was far more true today than it was 25 years ago. And so they're fluent in a lot of things I am not fluent in. And then the other thing, it's a little depressing. I don't know if you see it out at Southern Illinois. A lot of my foreign students actually write better in English than my American students do. They know what a split infinitive is. They know the power of the active voice versus the passive voice. They've had, I think, in many cases, better schooling in basic writing than a lot of American students, graduate students, many of whom did their undergraduate work at big name schools. And I find that a little bit discouraging and something that needs to be taken account of, at the local level in about 6th grade. So that's, one of the lessons I learned, but their perspectives are so different. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I had 2 Chinese students who worked for CCTV, the public, and we were having a debate about, as we have every semester, what's the government's role in policing the internet? And both of the Chinese students said, well, the government should just control everything that's on the internet. And they were perfectly sincere, representing a Chinese view. That sparked a great debate in the class. And that's the kind of thing I enjoy the most. And once again, it's listening to the students, not lecturing them.
Right. Well, what would you say, John, to students maybe who are watching this conversation who think or are thinking about a career in journalism? What advice would you give them about how to prepare for it, how to pursue it, and the pros and cons of it?
Well, first of all, learn to write. One of the best lines I've ever heard, and I'll pass this on to all the students out there and a lot of professors, a lot of politicians. Stephen King, who made more money writing 1 book than I made in a lifetime. The guy knows how to write. You may not like what he writes. It may not be to your taste. Great sentence. The adverb is not your friend. So we go around saying something is really true. No, it's not really true. It's either true or it's not true. Throw out the ly word. So learn those lessons, learn your strunk and white, learn what a split infinitive is, learn the difference between like and such as. I wound up teaching this in graduate school at Georgetown, that they don't mean the same thing. Such as means, for example, like means it resembles something. So you learn that stuff. It'll give you a great advantage over a lot of your competitors. Use the active voice, not the passive voice. So that's number 1. Number 2, I think practice. You don't even have to write it. Go out and listen to people. Talk to the guy who pumps your gas. Talk to the store clerk. Talk to the mayor. If you're in a small town, listen to him. What do you learn from him? What is his life like? Do you enjoy that? If you enjoy that, maybe you ought to consider a career in journalism. Look at the pros and cons of it. The big pro, I think, is that this country needs good journalism as much as it ever has, for the reasons that you and I talked about, John. But there are downsides. It's a damn hard way to make a living. And you got to be realistic about that. If you want to make a lot of money, go to the business school, join a hedge fund, or a venture capital firm, if that's what matters to you, be realistic about that. It's a hard way to make a living. It's often 7 days a week. It ain't no 8-hour-a-day job. It requires a lot of sacrifice. I remember I landed, here in Cape Cod, August of 1990, the same day Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. That was the end of that vacation, right back to Washington. And you simply have to accept those things. Something happens in the middle of the night, you're up covering it. That's more true today than it was in the era of the daily newspaper, which closed at a certain hour. Nothing ever closes now. So you got to be realistic about that. But do you love it enough to do it? That's the key question. Do you think it's important enough that it's worth the sacrifice? Not just you will have to make, but that your family, when you have one, will have to make. There's one year I spent 300 nights on the road away from home. Now that's a sacrifice my wife made. And you got to be realistic about that stuff too. So it's got to be a passion to make it worthwhile. I would say the same thing for someone who wants to be an artist or a performer, an actor, an actress, a musician. It's a tough road. And success is not guaranteed. But learn to write, please. Learn how to write. It'll serve you well, even if you wind up at the hedge fund.
Those are the words I tell my students too. And I also make the point, I said, read books. And that's, I think, the one thing that been struck about is how this new generation just has not grown up reading books. And I argue that a book is a fundamentally different construct than an article. I mean, it has to be, has to be undergirded, a good one, by a factual base and tell a story and keep you turning the page. And that's reading good works is a critical aspect of learning how to write.
Yeah, it's an uphill battle nowadays because attention spans have shrunk so much. There's always something coming in on the mobile phone or, wherever else that's a distraction. And links in an article are the same way. I consider them all off ramps, and frequently there's no on ramp. So you exit and you never come back. And it's not just books, but read. One of the people I learned a lot from when I was a young reporter was John McPhee, who's a professor at Princeton, but despite being a professor, actually knows how to write. And he writes the kind of stuff that carries you along. And one of the things that tends to carry you along, I think, going back to what I've said before, is some human connection. Make the characters real. Make the reader think, I want to know what happens to this person. I either like him or I think he's a villain, but I want to know what happens to him. I want to know the outcome of what's happening, whatever battle it is I'm covering. So yeah, read books, be selective about what you read. But Stephen King's a great writer. I don't much care for his subject matter, but his talent as a writer is unequivocal. McPhee, the same way. I was lucky to be reading a lot of what he was writing when I was working in New Jersey, which is where he was based. And one of his books about New Jersey inspired, a lead. I still remember I wrote a story for the Bergen Record, which is now a Gannett paper that no longer has anyone in Washington. But I was down in the sort of the countryside of southern New Jersey, away from the coast. And I wrote a story about a young woman whose name I don't recall. But the lead of the story said, she lived 30 miles from Atlantic City and had never seen the ocean. And that's the kind of writing I sort of was mimicking McPhee in doing, because immediately the reader asks, what? Well, why not? It's 30 miles an hour. Thousands of people from all over the East see the Jersey Shore every year. If you're fluent in New Jerseyan, they're going down a shore. There's a special expression, I'm going down a shore. And I guess the other thing I would say, if you have any interest in being a foreign correspondent, learn some languages. That's the other thing I find discouraging at Georgetown. My foreign students all often are taking my class and other classes at Georgetown in the master's program in their third or fourth language. And most of my American students are struggling to master their second. And I don't think we start teaching those early enough. I had a young woman who worked for me. I didn't realize she spoke Mandarin until I walked out of my office and noticed she was taking notes in Chinese, which prompted me to ask the same question about the young girl. What the hell is going on here? And she told me at one point, Susan Lawrence, she works at the Library of Congress now. She said, if you don't start learning a language like Mandarin at the age of 4, you'll never master it. So I think that's a problem we have to address in a globalized world, and not simply rely on the assumption that everybody speaks English. In fact, that often relying on English is a deficit. I remember going to a meeting in Tokyo once. We had a bureau chief, Jim Mpoko, lives down in Nashville now, great reporter, who was fluent in Japanese. We went to a meeting with a bunch of Japanese officials, and they would break during the conversation and speak to each other in Japanese. Jim never let on that he knew Japanese. And so he listened to every word they were saying to one another. We got up, the meeting was over, and Jim, speaking for the rest of us, said, "Arigato gozaimasu." And they said, "What, you speak Japanese?" And he replied in Japanese, "Yes, I spoke in Japanese." They were furious. It was as if we had broken some secret code that they were using. Man, does that give you an advantage. And I don't think, I struggled in Lebanon. I speak French, but I don't speak Arabic. And that limited the reporting I could do without an interpreter. Because the people who were making news in Lebanon in those days mostly spoke Arabic. Some of them spoke Farsi, but they were imports from Iran. So that's the other piece. Learn at least a second language. Nowadays, Spanish comes to mind immediately. And learn to write.
Great. Well, John, thank you for such a terrific conversation. It's been really interesting, and I'm going to continue to read your essays. They're incredibly well written and interesting and important. And I look forward to staying in touch, and maybe we can coax you to Carbondale sometime and meet with students here and look around the community and just kind of relay some of these remarkable experiences to the students and to the community here. So thank you so much, John. It's been a total delight.
My pleasure, John. And I hope I'll see you in Carbondale. We may be out that way. I've got a daughter in Cincinnati. And my wife and I may be going to a meeting out in Wichita. So we may be out that way this fall. And I'd love to stop by. I'd love to listen to your students, listen to people in the community, see what they think about what's going on in Washington. Actually practice what I've been preaching for the last hour.
Well, it would be great to have you here. So we will stay in touch and try to make that connection. So
by all means, thanks.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We'll have a video of this conversation on our website in the coming days. Please look at it, share it with family and friends. And thank you for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.